I say we go ahead and get started. And given the book that we are discussing, it is perfectly fine to turn off your video um, because you're probably acutely aware of how exhausting it is to have your video on. So I'll let other folks in as we go. But we're here today to discuss the book Can You Hear Me? By Nick Morgan, which was very presciently written in 2018 before the pandemic, but I thought it was worth revisiting. And I'm just curious, what did people, oh, Doug is joining us. What did people think about, what was kind of the experience of reading this book? What were you thinking as you were reading it? Hey, Doug, we just got started.
Sorry, I'm late.
Okay. It's December. I think everybody's running a little late this morning.
Wait, it's December? I'm really late.
I know.
2023, right? Thank
I
you.
think so. Yes.
Good.
So I just asked folks for a little bit of reflection on, as you read this book, kind of what was the overall thought that popped into your head or reflections. Anybody have anything they want to share?
I can share. I thought there was a theme here about the lack of emotion online, and I loved that they were bringing that to light. I think some of what we would normally have encountered in face-to-face meetings has really slipped away and changed the dynamic of how people are interacting. And especially given that some people are feeling a little more isolated, I liked that. And then it also pointed out to me the lack of consistency.
We can still hear you.
You can, I can't
Yeah.
see. The lack of consistency that people have in how these different mediums are used. So while we bounce between them all on a consistent basis, it's just funny there aren't a lot of rules that are out there that people follow consistently. And so I think that adds to some of the lack of knowing how best to use them and the varying success of the ways people do use them. But
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Suzanne. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but I liked the book. I liked that there was someone trying to address that idea, and maybe in time there'll be a little more consistency surrounding that so we can focus on what's happening in them as opposed to how they're happening.
Yeah, and this was written again in 2018. So, Doug would have had no idea at the time, but you're right, because I'm a consultant and so I work in whatever my client. So I've been in Teams, Zoom, and WebEx just in the last 3 hours and bouncing back and forth between the two. So I think that consistency is a really important point, as is emotion, which we're going to get back to. Anybody else have kind of an overall impression?
I was just going to tag on. I mean, we can see it here now. All of the senses are compressed. I think that concept kind of rang through a bit. I'm looking at thumbnails and I'm seeing faces, nothing else. And then the stuff about overtones and undertones and how much emotion is literally in that sound that we're not getting because of the compression that happens in audio. And then even the barometric pressure of the room, like, wow, and maybe how cold or hot it is, and on and on. Like, if you think of all the senses, smell, touch, all of it, it's like all of that is so muted or so compressed or non-existent, some of it. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, Doug. So I worked for AT&T for 7 years. And when I read that part about the phone overtones and undertones being compressed, I had no idea. And I worked in telephony. And so, yeah, one of the things that was very almost freeing to me when I first read this book was, oh, good, it's not just me, right? It's not like I'm an introvert. I don't like video. There are physiological reasons why this is a different experience that we can take into account when we judge ourselves, but also when we judge other people. And I think that's a piece of the research that doesn't get talked about enough.
Probably one of the reasons that movie, I forget what it's called and how many people have seen it, where there's some guy who was born on Pluto, let's say in the future, and he has a video relationship with a woman on Earth. And, his coming to Earth and then meeting, of course, is where all of the emotion and everything else happens. It's not in this basically video conference relationship that they had. Yeah, crazy.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. One of the things that has been coming up a lot lately is generational differences, and in particular, people who have started their careers in or post-pandemic, who may never have had the experience of going in to an office and physically being with a team, and they're used to all their conversations being maybe not even video, but actually just text. And what are the skills that or the experiences that are going to be different as a result of people working in this environment all the time?
It's funny because I am an introvert. And so as I read through the book, I was thinking through the pros and cons, and the back to office movement. Now I get it. Depending on who you are, that may or may not still not that may or may not work for you. Either way. And I think understanding that, yes, in general, there's less communication over the virtual mechanisms, and how that plays to you and your strengths or not is helpful too. Because for me, being in an office around people 40 hours a week is kind of exhausting. Suzanne's laughing.
Because you missed me. That was what it
I
was.
missed you. Yes.
Yeah.
So Suzanne and Stephanie used to work together, apparently. So
Yeah,
we're having a reunion of sorts.
I think too, for some of these people that really rely on technology, the younger group of workers, it's probably a good stepping stone for them that happened at the time it did. Because I think for those who were using a lot of texting just to communicate all the time, it is somewhat of a shock to then have to be at work all the time, interacting with people, being the one to lead things. It's hard. So I think in a way, maybe there was a little silver lining there for those younger people that were just entering the workforce. And it's nice to see that a lot of companies now are starting to blend that, and they can start using these additional skills. You asked what skills? I'm trying to think, like what skill? I guess that proactive communication with others face to face. And that's not easy for everyone.
Yeah. And I think things like reading a room. I mean, I'm a
Yeah.
professional speaker, so I am not the person who is, I'm probably an outlier on that. But I facilitated a meeting recently for someone, and um, the manager whose team it was admitted that he is just not good at reading a room. And so as we were having these conversations, even when people were physically there, he wanted some help kind of getting a feel for what was there. And reading a virtual room is very different from reading a physical room. So yeah, I think you're right. That is one of the skills. I just want to acknowledge that Deb McKay joined us. Hi, Deb. You don't have to come on video. I just want to make sure you knew we were here. Does anybody feel like you have a particular piece of virtual communication that you struggle with? I mean, Stephanie, you said it, for you as an introvert, this is kind of nice because it's tamping down on some of the other external stimuli. For me, this is going to sound really, really silly, but the light, I get really hot. If I sit on a virtual call for a long time and I have my lights down here, like my cheeks will start turning red and I get really hot. And it creates this cycle where I'm like, my God, do people think I'm nervous? Do people think I'm whatever? And it's like, no, I just literally am getting a sunburn from my lights.
You have strong lights.
It's not actually a sunburn, but it is enough. I don't know. Maybe it could also just be a hot flash. Who knows?
Never know.
I think there's a balance in the pros and cons. I mean, I do. I take advantage of the fact that I'm on a meeting, you know, oh, that text came in. I'm trying to arrange a haircut for tomorrow, you know. I can do that really quickly without missing a beat. Well, I'm missing something. I know that. And also in some cases, I used to like first interviews maybe for a job being on the phone because I could have all my notes in front of me. Well, it's kind of similar, sometimes whether I'm presenting or it's some other kind of meeting, I can have all this stuff around me and nobody sees it. Can't really do that live in a meeting room. It just doesn't fly.
Yeah, I do. I probably wouldn't bring distracted Dan to a meeting. I went to a conference from a company called Churn Zero, and they have it's a customer success company, and they have characters for all of the different types of customers who churn. And this is Disengaged Dan. They also have a whole bunch of other ones, but he stays with me. But yeah, I wouldn't bring a stuffed animal to a meeting. And another thing I'm curious about, folks, taking notes. I can kind of sort of touch type. I will very often take physical notes, and I feel the urge to lift up my pen and put it against my cheek every once in a while. So the person knows that if I'm not looking at them, it's because I'm taking notes, not because I'm multitasking. And I don't know why I feel that compulsion, but if we were physically in a room, you would see that I was taking notes and you wouldn't wonder, oh, is she looking down at her phone making a haircut? Does anybody else notice that, or notice when other people, like, do you pay attention to whether other people are paying attention?
It's,
What?
it's
No.
No.
I was gonna
Okay.
say it's one of those things where, like, especially if you're presenting, I think there's a little more tendency to like I was trying to present to some folks a week or so ago, and it's all virtual, and I'm trying to figure out on my two screens how to get their faces up so I can see how they're reacting. Because I knew there were some things that could be touchy for a couple of folks. It's like, how is this going to go over? Is it going to land like like a ton of bricks? Is it going to just, they're not going to be as concerned? And it's much, much harder to do that, like Doug said, with the tiny little pictures and where the heck is it on your screen? And it zips out of the wherever you want it, whenever it can. So
I would
Yeah.
think too, on the topic of notes, that it's important for the person leading the call, if they see people with their head down writing a lot of notes, perhaps something needs to slow down, or there needs to be pre-notes, or there needs to be a follow-up or something said, because if someone's preoccupied that much with the notes, there might be something that needed to be communicated further.
That's really interesting. I'm a prolific note taker, so it wouldn't have occurred to me because I'm always taking a ton of notes. But yeah, it's, being able to understand and get a feel for, is the pace of the material, whatever we're covering, is it too slow? Is it too fast? That's another piece of this that it's harder to see. And we just had Michael join us. So Michael, welcome. You don't have to turn on your video for this particular call. We all know it can be tiring.
Thank
So
you.
I'm not making it a
I'm
requirement.
I'm on my phone anyways. I'll try to join a little bit on the video.
No, that's okay. So we're kind of going back and forth between a couple of the discussion questions. We're talking a little bit about some of what you learned about virtual communication that surprised you. What are some of our personal own struggles with this particular medium, and just what are some of the ways that we've changed our habits to account for, the sort of classic pandemic meme was business on the top, PJs on the bottom, which is not true. I am actually wearing hard pants, AKA jeans. But how have how have we changed our behavior as a way, in response to the fact that we have so much more of this virtual communication?
One thing I think is interesting, that some of this isn't new. So 10, maybe 15 years ago, I remember being in meetings and taking notes on my computer. And several times I was pulled aside, are you in the meeting or are you doing work? I said, well, I'm taking notes. It's like,
Yep.
oh, the proper way to take notes is with that pen or pencil that you have to hold against your cheek now so people see it. Otherwise, it's not taking notes, you're doing work. And then the moment you see one of these is like you're texting. Well, this does a lot more than text. And I found myself in some cases taking notes on this.
Mhm.
And then there's this thing on your wrist. It's like, oh, you're bored. You're checking the time. You want to see how much time there is left. It's like, no, I just got an alert and oh my God, my wife needs something. Or, I'm making stuff up here, but it's like
Yeah.
we all have these associations, and I'm sure most of us, I do it myself, even though I know it's not true. This means text. And it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily mean text, but we've all come to believe that. So I don't know. Now we just have that much more of it. It's all compounded, and we're dealing with all of it at the same time. And I don't know. I'm a little bit maybe I tend to over index. If I'm taking notes, I'm looking away here. I find myself always nodding, like,
Mm.
because what I feel a subconscious need to let Megan know I'm listening to her and I'm taking down what she says. Is that what that is? I think so.
I have been
Yeah.
told that I am weirdly and uniquely engaged online. Like people are like, when you're online, everybody else's face is just kind of like, and you're always animated. And I think I do it for the same reason, Doug. I'm like, well, they have to know I'm paying attention. Deb, sorry, I think I jumped on your words.
No, that's totally fine. I was just gonna, affirm Doug as well. Same thing. I was nodding while he was speaking, but I remember being in the office and having a meeting, and when people had computers out, 10, 15 years ago, it was annoying. And now it's like, of course they're out. Thank you. So it's also interesting to see how things change, but I like how you went through the whole perspective of eventually the watches won't bother us either, but we project what we might be doing with those tools as well.
Well, and it's one of the most useful frameworks I've ever learned just for living as a human is the concept, instead of asking yourself what's going on, asking yourself what is the story I'm telling myself about what's going on, because they can be two different things. And Doug, I think what you're introducing is the concept of a whole nother set of stories.
Yeah,
like if you check your watch, even in a physical meeting, most people wouldn't think twice about it. You check your watch, or looking at the time, whatever. But there's so much more that it could be, that we could tell ourselves as a story, and we don't necessarily know what it is.
It goes back to your point, Megan, of reading the room and not being able to do that any longer. I mean, I think
Yeah.
everyone has such different ways that they do their work, whether it's notes or anything. Some people are using paper, some people are using phones, some people, and it's not even generational. It's just personal. Like there's so much offered to us to customize that online, that particular thing makes it even harder to read the room.
One of the
Yeah.
questions I kept asking myself as I was reading is, to Doug's point, how new is this? And have we actually, he mentions that this experiment has started in the last, 20 or 30 years. I'm like, I don't know, maybe it goes back to when electricity became a thing and we could now work all times a day effectively. And, and being every time something, the telephone or something else gets created, it just adds more volume and more, just more. And so how much of it is all those options, Suzanne, versus just, and we haven't figured out how to handle the fact that we could be on 24 hours a day. Whereas it used to be you went to bed when the sun went down or soon after.
Yeah, it really requires a lot of self-discipline, I think.
Yeah. And
I wondered if it's a different perspective of, are we just all insecure about our place in the work world because there's so much pressure out there to overperform because companies are putting that pressure on us. So we're all at that mercy of what else should I be doing? How am I being judged? Because I don't want that extra judgment.
Yeah. And that's true with email norms and video norms. I had a client I was working with where the contract holder, my direct contact's boss, was of a certain generation, and he would use Teams, but he never got on the video. And my client told me right from the beginning, do not ever expect him to show up on video because he just doesn't do it. And I'm sort of going, would I feel like I had permission to do that? Like I kind of gave him permission because of his age, but if I just decided I don't do video, would that be socially acceptable? Would it be, how would other people react? And I don't know the answer to that.
Probably depends who you are.
Yeah. And I think how long you've known the person. So funny story, I had the chance to physically meet in person a client that I had only ever dealt with over the phone or on video. And he's like 6'6". And I had no idea because we're like this. And I met him in person and I was like, oh my, you're all the way up there. And I just never even thought about how tall or how short he was. I don't know why I told that story. I thought it was funny. Are there any norms? This is one of the things I'm curious. Suzanne, you mentioned, things are different. There's inconsistency in every. Are there norms that your organization or you yourself or people have kind of made up about how this should work in the absence of any other sort of bigger kind of, social norms? Like Gloria, you always have a background. And I've had a lot of folks who always have a corporate background. It could be virtual, it could be a thing, but in some companies that's a thing. And you always have to have a background. And others, they're like, we don't care if your dog walks across the screen. So is there anything like that people have kind of developed?
Well, I wanted to just say that, it's true that AMA is quite conservative. And our brand is the physician's powerful ally in patient care. And so, we'll use kind of corporate looking background most of the time because of that. We want to convey a message. But also it turns out that it happened to work real well as sort of a response to our contact center and our entire AMA team being home for COVID. People didn't really want to expose their homes. We had some agents who say, I don't live in a beautiful home like maybe you do. I really don't want people to see where I live. And so we started promoting. And so that's why I don't use video. And we said, well, but we want to be part of our conversation. We want to be able to look into each other's eyes and understand what's going on emotionally and, whether we're, communicating. So how about you get used to using these backgrounds? So that actually helped us, but it happened to be consistent for most of the senior leadership. We almost always use backgrounds. My office happens to be in a little tiny bedroom up in a old house. And so I don't like to have a little bed behind me. I mean, it's not terrible to look at, but it just seems a little weird, might make some people uncomfortable. But so I think it kind of works. But we actually even recognize people for using their backgrounds. So we just are looking at our performance appraisals. It's expected for our management team because we know how important it is to work as a team. But our contact center for agents at all levels of agents, we have a component called professionalism and communication. And we actually recognize people in their leadership performance factor for doing everything they can to communicate with their colleagues. And that means using your video, being actively engaged in meetings, all the things that we hear in the book that help people understand how to connect with you. And we sort of share it like that. And so people get recognized for it, and it can raise that little objective by about, if you were only at a level 3, which is you just met it, you're going to exceed it. Maybe not at a level 5, but you're going to get a level 4 because of that. And the recalcitrants will still be recalcitrants, but most people now are using video because there's kind of carrot and a stick. We can't tell you, we won't give you below a 3 if you absolutely refuse. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting that it was that. I know a lot of companies went through that. I mean, this room is staged. This room has been set up. That shelf wasn't there. Everybody's
Yeah.
got their, suddenly we're all Steven Spielberg, framing things. But yeah, I think it was a very real thing about how much of ourselves, our home life, are we comfortable bringing to work. This literally kind of exposes that. But I realized as you were talking, Gloria, that we've been talking a lot about meetings. I'm curious what people think about events. I went to an all virtual event 2 weeks ago. It was the world's first psychological safety day, and it was from noon to 4. And oh my, it was nonstop. There was not a break to go get a cup of coffee, to go to the bathroom, and there were multiple rooms and everything. And the content was great. But I felt like suddenly norms that we would have in a physical event just disappeared in a virtual event. And I was like, oh, I don't think I necessarily like this that much. So do people do a lot of virtual events? Have you gone to virtual conferences?
I've done a couple, but they've had breaks built in just as if you were in person. So you kind of knew when you had the 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That would be tough without.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe that was just that conference.
Well, one thing that I took away, it's an event type thing, but maybe it's a little bit of a riff off of that. We have, our contact center is primarily virtual, and we spend, hours of training and with our team. And we've always been big advocates for instructional design, using learner reinforcement, engaging the learners. But after reading this book, and our team knows that's my big hobby horse. If we don't see reinforcement in the instructional design, it's going to go back, and they have to go back to work on it. But after reading this book, I thought, well, maybe what we're doing is still not enough, because you can still lay back in a classroom. In a classroom, you can kind of tell who's drifting, right? There's lots of behaviors that you can easily, I watch people's hands, I watch people's slouch, you can kind of get a sense. But in video, you can really fake it. I've faked it myself. I've faked it during senior leadership meetings, right? I've faked it. So we were just, after reading this, our team was talking about what we can do to really, like, mid-ships, not wait for the learner engagement, the official stuff, but kind of bring it through all the way through the training as much as we can. And so we're experimenting on something right now, it's a quality corner, getting people to interact throughout the training, just eliciting some response, with the idea that it's changing our culture, that we can expect that to happen. We can expect that it will be more conversational. So if you expect that, I'm kind of thinking you'd be less likely to use your faking skills and therefore get really engaged and really get a broader outcome from it.
Yeah, I think as speakers, we have to work harder. I took a thing through the National Speakers Association that said, assume everyone is watching your keynote on an iPhone and design your slides accordingly. And that was game changing. But But also, you know, one of the cool things that I've seen is, Stephanie, you talked about being an introvert. I am too. But there are people who would never in a million years raise their hands and ask questions in a room. They will ask questions in the chat. Even when we had unmute yourself and say the question with phone meetings, they still wouldn't do it. But there's this whole group of people who are willing to ask questions, or they'll use, I did a series of meetings with a client, and I was shocked at how many people used the reactions. We had hearts and clapping hands and stuff going. At first, it was distracting, but then it was a way of people signaling that they were engaged. It was a webinar. I couldn't see any of them. There were 1,000 of them. But it was kind of nice reinforcement. Yes, Stephanie, as you're laughing all over the place. But I think there are some good things that have come out of this in terms of making some people feel more comfortable interacting in less personal ways. Have you guys seen that or dealt with that?
I certainly have. I mean, I think as reactions and you know, I was doing the double thumbs up because I think it's Zoom that will interpret that as well. When these things come up, they're a little bit of a novelty, and I think people play with them, but they also start to realize that it does have some impact to the meeting. You are giving feedback. It's not nearly as good as, you know, the being there. Yeah, for sure. I wanted to, I don't mean to do too much of a sidebar here because I think it's very relevant, but Megan, where you were just saying the whole idea of, you know, as a speaker, imagine that everybody's watching you on an iPhone. That's something that really goes back to good old transistor radios. So if anybody's familiar with Motown, the Detroit, you know, Jackson 5 and all the other you know, great R&B artists of the 70s and that time frame, the in the sound room, you know, they've got all the latest greatest equipment you can hear through beautiful stereo and the rest of it, but they also had a transistor radio, and they made sure that whatever the musicians were recording, it was mixed in such a way it was going to work on that device because that's what everybody had. And it's kind of the same thought, and if we apply that to almost everything we do, it's like, all right, what's the least common denominator here? I'm going to make sure this whatever experience works on an Apple Watch or on a transistor radio or on an iPhone, whatever it is. It's kind of fun.
So I kind of want to bridge on that. So Doug, you're kind of talking about the design of the experience. When we were talking about the people who will put notes in chat and so forth, I think it leads to a lot of cases. There's like another person that needs to be in the presentation side. You've got the person who's speaking and somebody else is watching the chat and keeping that going. The groups that I've had this way that have that are most effective if you're going to use the chat room. Somebody's in there real time. It's not the speaker trying to do both.
Yeah, I completely agree. In this Psychological Safety Day conference I was in, there were a lot of peanut gallery comments. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but you wouldn't in a room full of people suddenly shout out, yes, oh my God, ha, ha, ha. And the chat was blowing up with those. And then somebody would ask a real question. And just as a viewer, I wasn't even speaking. I was trying to follow it. And I was like, eventually I said, I have to turn that off because I can't concentrate. And I was like, you would never just, I mean, some people might, but you know, you would never generally do that in a room full of people.
Like the scroll at the bottom. Pardon me. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say as an aside, it's like the scroll on the bottom of the news. You know, are you listening or are you reading what's happening on the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask is the chatting also a little bit generational? 'Cause in other words, do you see the equal amount of chatting independent of how old people are? Because I would imagine the comfort level of somebody younger who couldn't raise their hand in person is going to chat more than the older person who had no problem back in the day raising their hand. So is it flipped at all?
In terms of questions, yes, I think I see that absolutely. In terms of random outbursts and side comments, I don't know because I couldn't see the other people that were in, you know, there were so many other people. It was more of a webinar format.
Because that
that's
means
an interesting question.
Facilitator, we have to figure out how to engage the people that you can engage easily in person, but harder online because they're being overwhelmed by the people who have no problem chatting stuff that also is meaningless at times, right?
Yeah.
Well, Michael,
Yeah.
I think I was just gonna say, Michael brings up an interesting point. In the room, you can guess the generations. It
Right.
can be a lot harder when you can't necessarily see everybody.
Well, I can remember the first time we started presenting. We have a big CX forum every year that we present to the AMA, and part of it is to recognize people who are doing great work, and the other part is to move our bystanders into more active members of our CX transformation. And we had done our very first live event, and it was fabulous. And so then we were all home for COVID, and the show had to go on, and it had to be remote. And we were just new at this, and oh my gosh, we started running the chats on the right, and we started having all of the emojis coming up. And I am a pretty experienced presenter, and I almost lost my cool. Like I was having a hard time really focusing, because I was also trying to figure out, where in the camera am I supposed to look? Are you seeing me? Do you want me to look right at the camera? Do I look midships? Do I look like I'm thinking? And
Yeah.
all of that was going on. And I thought, wow, this takes me back to when I didn't know how to use a podium or a microphone, right? So I just think it goes to communication and how we just have to be flexible, and particularly think about the medium, the communication channel. It's just marketing, right? And who's listening. How many people know who their audience is when they're in, like, do we really know? I think that's kind of become my issue, is that we use Zoom so much and Teams. I don't always know exactly who I'm communicating with. So it's really hard to make things audience centric. And I don't know, maybe I thought about that when I read this book. I think I'm hardwired to do my best work in person. So I think I am definitely an adapter to technology, and it just may be that. But I wondered if anybody else had a thought on that
I
could help.
I don't like the fact that people, I mean, I think it's okay to go from video and then you need to turn into your photograph for a second for the dog or whatever. But I think really insisting on video is so important. And I do a roundtable for CXPA every 6 weeks, and I'm just floored. And I have to say, really disappointed in how many people, including CXPA, they don't use video. And I'll implore them to use video, but they don't. And but somehow setting the standard for, if you're going to be part of the meeting, show who you are, like be involved. Like you wouldn't do that in person, right? You wouldn't
Right.
put a brown box over you. You wouldn't sit in the audience and put a brown box over you.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's where some of the social norms are coming out, because I have had people say to me, and I have said to people, you know what, I'm just not having a video day. If you don't mind, I won't turn my camera on. And most people, when that happens, will also turn their camera off. And I think sometimes we're a little bit like, oh, thank God, I don't have to, worry about that. But there are, kind of these norms that we're having to learn. Gloria, you made a comment that I don't want to let slide about you being hardwired to do your best work in person. We all are. And I think that was one of the main points of this book that I knew but didn't appreciate, is how much of our communication is built in to be physical and sensing things in a physical environment, because our brains haven't changed much in 10,000 years. And our world has accelerated more. So I think, people may be more naturally comfortable on video versus others, but I think it's important to recognize that as human beings, we are working with, I call the brain the ultimate legacy technology.
Yeah.
We are working with the equipment that we have, And, you know, that's not going to change that quickly.
Well, I don't want to dominate here, but it's just really funny. So, you know, Carrie Bodine. So we hired her this year to work with us to deploy a CX design program at the AMA. And I worked with her. I knew her before on video. I worked with her all year. And then we had our showcase about, I think she came to our CX forum this summer too. So it was this summer. She came and we had this big event. And she came up to me afterwards. Now we've been working together for probably years, you know, but remotely. And she said, Gloria, I had no idea your power, or whatever she said. I can't remember. She was gobsmacked. And I thought, I don't think I come off so differently in video, but it really made me step back and think about the medium. And even to the point where I thought maybe I just need some instruction about how to be more effective and how to connect to my audience. Like, Megan, there's a big business model for you. If you become the SME, I think we'll all be taking your class.
Well, you know, it's an interesting, and it's actually a really big topic in the speaker world. You know,
Yeah.
some people, like, I just have not done a ton of virtual keynotes. I would never in a million years, even if I'm just in a room facilitating, I would not sit down. I cannot speak sitting down.
Right.
I have no choice but to sit down here, right? So that absolutely changes my mannerisms, my affect, you know. And I think, Gloria, it's also an interesting point that we don't necessarily realize how we come off.
No.
I had no idea how many times I look up and to the right until I started recording videos and watching them and going, oh my God, it looks like I'm not paying attention. And I was totally unconscious of what I was doing. And nobody's ever said anything about it. People have said, oh, you're great on video. I'm like, okay, can't be that big of a problem. But yeah, there are all these new things that.
But you know, that's forgiving. If you were in person and we were talking and you were either in a meeting or you were presenting, that is something we forgive. I don't even think we notice it. You might, because we're used to people. In fact, it can be a very effective persuasive technique to stop talking and look like you're thinking. You know, there's a lot of people who tell you to do that, right?
So let me play devil's advocate there. Very, very near and dear to my heart in a toxic work situation last year. I tend to, in meetings, I'm doing it right now, I look up a little bit when I think, and I hear what you say, Gloria. I'm very forgiving of that too. There's a belief, there were some studies about this years ago. Of course, like so many other studies, they've been absolutely debunked at this point, that says you're hiding something when you're not giving, you know, absolute eye contact. Now, this was through a video conference. It was through a new boss that I was under who, yes, actually really truly had it in for me from the beginning, all that stuff. And he was talking to me about our conversation, how I was doing that and what I must be hiding. It was
Right.
an incredible situation. So it depends on your perspective. If you come from that belief and you're looking for there's a smoking gun, there must be something hidden there, I'm going to get you. Well, that's going to happen. That's going to happen not much more maybe than it is in person.
Yeah. And I think it's harder to, it's funny, I'm working on a piece of research right now with a friend of mine who's a CMO. It's about trust in transition. So in leadership transitions, how does customer and employee trust ebb and flow, and kind of best practices for leaders on both sides? And I'm working with someone right now who has a brand new boss who is the complete personality opposite of her old boss. And so all of this, what does that mean? Is he doing that because he's just not as energetic? Is it that, you know, I think all of that becomes that much harder. I mean, we had virtual teams, you know, even 20 years ago, but all of those social dynamics become much, much harder in this virtual environment.
I agree with you on the points too of the audience and not knowing who your audience is. And I do consulting, and part of that is meeting with clients. And you could have maybe 3 faces that are new to you, and then 5 that are not showing their face, and you don't know who they are, you don't know how they're reacting, and you're presenting something that either is your deliverable or you're selling. And that's a very difficult thing to tailor your conversation to that. And then additionally, these types of things are recorded. So where does it go from there? So who, oh, I just looked up. No, was that okay? Is it forgivable? Wait, I just
You
did
know,
it.
Stephanie, that's a great, sorry, Suzanne, that's a great point because there's a lot of conversation right now going on about the etiquette of AI. So my assistant, Kate, her fireflies.ai note taker is in here right now. You know, half the time you have twice as many attendees because everybody brought their AI assistant. And the etiquette of, is it okay? When do you ask? I mean, most people wouldn't know, is the state you live in a 1 or a 2-party consent state? Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state. I couldn't record something legally without you knowing it. But companies want to use audio transcripts and video of sales meetings to get customer intelligence, and their clients are like, full stop. No, we're not recording these conversations.
Yeah.
And so I think that does create a whole, Rhode Island is 1 party. Good to know, Doug. I will keep that in mind. Don't record me secretly. But yeah, I think it does make people more conscious, and it's a whole new kind of dance that we have to do in terms of communication. Unless you're a reporter, it generally wasn't commonplace to walk into a room and stick a recording device down on the table. That's basically what we're doing every day now.
You know, I wanted to just interject something, maybe a little bit different way of looking at all of this too. We keep on talking about how video conference or, you know, using Zoom and things like that are not as good as the live thing. But what about the opposite, where it's so much better than the phone in some ways?
Yeah.
Like, I've had at least that much feeling out of interactions on Zoom that this is so much better. Like, I can't imagine personally not having my camera on anymore. And I am an introvert. I guess I'm an outgoing introvert. But I can't not have my camera on. And, you know, I want others to have their camera on too. And it's just so much better than the telephone. Like, why there are landlines in offices now is beyond me. They're never used, are they?
I don't know if they are, but I do want, real quickly, because Doug, you brought up a great point that I wanted to bring up. We've been really fixated on video because that's kind of the most dominant and most different. I'm doing a workshop next week on written communication and email communication. It's a contact center team, and most of their interaction back and forth is through email. And we're talking about emotion in email and text, how you convey it, how you read it, the challenges that that creates. They're trying to inject more empathy into their conversations. And so that's a piece of virtual communication that's been around for, you know, 30 some odd years. But as I've done research for this, and I know Nick talks about it in the book, it's really hard. The team from Comcast actually told me it took them 6 months to get approval to use 6 emojis in their customer interactions online. And it was very regulated which emojis they could use. But just having the free, like if you send a 1-line text that says okay and an emoji with it, that can mean 17 different things. And I don't think we think enough about how that form of distanced visual digital communication, I don't think we've done as much thinking about how that's different.
It's interesting how big on emojis this guy was in his book. Right, he made a big point about use emojis.
Yeah, I didn't.
Shows emotion, and I didn't know if that was sort of a relic of 2015 or if that was still apropos.
Well, it's funny. If you follow Josh Burnoff, who is a former colleague of mine on Forrester and a writing coach, He basically thinks that if you use emojis, you're an unprofessional slouch, like one emoji and you're dead to me. But that's very Josh. He's very, he has his things. But there was a whole conversation in the comments on his post about exclamation points and emojis and what is too much. I think the point that Nick is trying to make is that imagery added to text has been used for thousands of years in human communication. Now, emojis happen to have a cartoon-like format, but like the colon
Yeah.
and parentheses smile, there is a functional value to using some of these images that I think we're still negotiating whether it's appropriate or not. I mean, Gloria, I would imagine you don't use them a lot.
Who was? Well, I just was getting ready to respond. So in the contact center, in our contact center, we integrated chat as a service channel, but also as a CX interventional strategy for our hotspots. So it's like we'll use chat, we'll embed chat where we know there are potential breakpoints while we're solving something, right? To kind of mitigate the impact for our customers. Anyway, big conversation about how we were going, whether in email, we use templates, we use response templates. And we're very emphatic about that because physicians who we primarily serve are very, they're documentation oriented. So we want to make sure that anything that we document is represents the AMA well. So, but we're constantly trying to bring those templates down to their core, right? So that we don't have a lot of reading time. So then big conversation about, and there we were very clear, no use of, you don't need to use exclamation marks, less is more, no hyphens, try no quotes, try no italics, just get to the point. So then when we transferred to chat, it was sort of the same thing. And we said, well, let's take our content templates and let's shrink them for chat. And that was okay. But those of our team who are much different generation than me started saying, look at the chats we're getting back from our customer and look at the template we are following. Can't we make our chats more conversational? Okay, so now we're going down the slippery slope of, okay, here we go. So, all right, so we tested that this year and we tested it for agent satisfaction scores, customer effort score, quality of the agent's performance. There was no impact. There was no untoward impact. So we thought, okay, let's go for it. So then our crack team, who are highly engaged, decided to say, well, how about we add a little emotion to this? You're always talking about empathy and blah, blah, blah. How about it? We get to pick the emoji that we wanted. And that's where we just sort of stopped because I said, our emotion, we can always transfer to phone. We can always switch the channel. But I was just not sure. And I still don't, school is out on this. So I'm interested to hear how you people, we're in this equity, diversity, inclusion world. And I'm just not sure that LOL or ha 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 or a heart or an exclamation mark would really resonate so significantly that it would change the way I felt about that interaction. So I'm interested, like we're all, maybe I'm the oldest person on this call, but we're all of a certain age. Would you want to see an emoji in a service chat?
Definitely. I'm a
Definitely.
big emoji person.
You are?
I am.
Wait,
Yeah.
who's an emoji person? Martha?
I've become an emoji person because I feel like it's mandatory. Like people just so expect them, but I do think I'm a little old school. I think it's a cheap shot. I think it's a cheap way to avoid clear writing. And words have been used for thousands of years very successfully to convey emotion. But I do think it's just, if you don't do an emoji, it feels like you're missing something. You're not reinforcing that you're happy or that you're thoughtful or, that you agree. I think that they're just how we need to, I think it's the accepted norm.
I think it goes back to Megan's point. We're still negotiating. I think that's a perfect way to say it. I mean, you can meet everybody where they're exactly at, because everyone's not at the same place. So for some people, it is expected, to Martha's point, and other people would be like, wait a minute, be offended. So, in person, you could read the room. You could see if you're going in a direction where it's not meeting the person where they're at, and you can shift. But on virtual, on chat, you're taking a shot. So that's maybe it's a cheap shot, maybe it's not, but it is a shot at communicating with them. So that's what I think emojis are really doing, is they're taking a stab of going beyond the letters and saying, I want to convey my emotion to you, but I'm taking a risk that you may not feel it the same way.
Yeah. And
That's
they
why it's
feel
not
more
good.
informal. I
Yeah.
think, like, I have clients I've known for a long time, I would use them with. I have other clients I haven't. I just want to be conscious of the top of the hour. Sounds like we could even do another session on this, which I would actually be open to, because we didn't even get into social media and using like images for numbers in LinkedIn posts. Don't get me started. I am old school there. But I hope this has been a useful conversation. I hope reading the book has been useful. We can continue the conversation on the chat. Feel free to use emojis if you want. Don't if you don't want to in the discussion group. But
I'll
I
tell
did
you
want
where we land. It'll be a real, what do you call that? You just like, I don't know.
It'll be a watershed moment. Yeah. Stay tuned. Yeah. And it is a big deal for brands. I just want to let you guys know we have picked the next book for 2025. The meeting's going to be sometime in mid-February, and the book is called Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. If you ever read The Power of Habit, it's the same author, and it's on this topic of communication, but it's much broader and looks at how you listen, how you do. So I think this group is really going to like it, but you'll get notes through the system from that. But I felt like I missed you guys. I hadn't seen everybody in a long time. So thank you for coming, and have a happy holiday, happy New Year, and we'll talk to you in February, if not sooner.
Thank you,
for
Megan.
hosting.
Great, yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Holidays.
Megan.
Holiday.
You too.
Good work.
Bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.